exalted, the King is exalted on high. I will praise Him. Oh, He is exalted, forever exalted, and I will praise His name. He is the Lord, forever His truth shall reign. Heaven and earth rejoice in His holy name. He is exalted, the King is exalted on high.
Oh, you are exalted, Lord.
He is exalted, He is exalted on high. I will praise Him. He is exalted, forever exalted, and I will praise Your name.
Oh, Lord, forever. He is the Lord.
He is the Lord.
Thank you, Lord.
Forever His truth shall reign.
Oh, worthy, 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 worthy. Oh, worthy, 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 worthy.
Rejoice in His holy name. He is exalted.
You are exalted, Lord. Oh, you are worthy, Lord. King of glory. Oh,
King of glory, fill this place. I just want to be with You. I just want to be with You. Oh, King of glory, fill this place. I just want to be with You. Just want to be with You. And I'll sing hallelujah till You come again.
that your praise will
And
never
I'll dance
silence my
in Your
mouth of
presence till You come again.
I'll sing and I'll sing and I'll sing and I'll
Just sing hallelujah till You come again.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
I'll dance in Your presence till You come again.
Oh, we'll keep singing, Lord, your praises.
We'll sing
Oh,
hallelujah
Lord, you are worthy, you are worthy, you are worthy. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah.
We'll dance in Your
Oh,
presence
King of
till
glory.
You come again. Just sing hallelujah. Glory, fill His place.
We just want to be with you. Oh, we just want to be with you. Oh, King of glory.
King of glory, fill His place. We just wanna be with You.
Want to be with you. Oh, King of
Just
glory.
wanna be with You.
Hosanna, Hosanna.
Hosanna.
I'm glad John travels because that gives me a chance to come. So we're glad to be here. Yvonne and I were this past week down at St. Mary's on the coast. And as the week went by and I was thinking about this service, and I'm thinking, what is it, Lord, that you would have for your people? He always has fresh bread for his people. You know, God doesn't feed his people stale bread. He feeds them fresh bread, bread from heaven. And I was reading on the couch in our little studio down there. About Wednesday or so, God began to show me something, and I just took note of it, something in the scripture as I read through the Old Testament. Have you noticed that 1 Kings and 2 Kings is that 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles is really a repeat of 1 Kings and 2 Kings? And the way I look at that is, if it's that important to God that he repeated it twice, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles is a repeat of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, that it really must be important to God what he's saying in those verses and the lessons that we can learn there. So as I was reading this week, I was reading about really probably one of the more obscure kings in the history of Israel and Judah, and his name was Abijah. And if you want to turn there, it's in 2 Chronicles chapter 13. And it's a repeat, somewhat of a repeat, of what God had already stated in 1 Kings chapter 15. But this is 2 Chronicles chapter 13, and he's showing us again this somewhat obscure king named Abijah. He only reigned for 3 years, and he wasn't a particularly good guy. In fact, back in 1 Kings chapter 15, it says that in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam became king over Judah. And he reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem, and they always list the mother's name. And it says, and he walked in all the sins of his father. So he wasn't a particularly good king. He was a sinful man, and he reigned for only 3 years. But here in the 13th chapter of 2 Chronicles, it goes back over those events in Abijah's life as God repeated the story. And this one starts out in verse 1. It says, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king over Judah, and he reigned 3 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. And there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Jeroboam was the king over the 10 tribes of Israel. Abijah was the king over the 2 tribes of reigning from Jerusalem. So because of war, and if you go back and look at those few verses that they talk about him in 1 Kings, it says there was war, there was war, there was war. His whole life there was war between him and Jeroboam, who was king over Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel. So in verse 3 it says, Abijah set the battle in order with an army of valiant warriors. So there's a war, there's a battle going on. It seemed like his entire 3-year reign was one of trouble. And it could have been because he was an evil man. I don't know why God was allowing all this to happen in his particular reign, but he was faced with it. And so he gathered around him the men of his 2 tribes, 400,000 choice men, and set them in order to go to battle against Jeroboam. But Jeroboam also drew up in battle formation against him, with 800,000 choice men, mighty men of valor. So we have Abijah with his 400,000, and we have Jeroboam with his 800,000. and they went out to face each other in battle. In other words, there was trouble in this man's life. He was faced with a huge problem, much bigger than his resources, much bigger than what he had. There were 800,000 of them coming against half his number, and they were all lined up getting ready to go to war. So then Abijah stood on Mount Zemarium, which is in the mountains of Ephraim, and said, and this is what I want you to really hear about out of this passage here, and what this man learned, and what we can learn from what he learned. So it says he stood on Mount Zemarium, which is in the mountains of Ephraim, and he began to speak. And he said, "Hear me, Jeroboam and all Israel. You should know, or should you not know, that the Lord God of Israel gave dominion over Israel to David forever, to him and his sons by a covenant of salt." And he began to remind his enemy, Jeroboam, of what God had said earlier, and the way God had actually intended for it to take place, that he gave dominion over Israel, which included the tribes that Jeroboam was king over at that time, to Israel, to David, forever, to him and his sons by a covenant of salt. Yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled against his Lord. So that's a short encapsulation of the history of what had taken place. Once the tribe split, Jeroboam became king over Israel, rose up with all his men, and established a new nation. And because he didn't want the people that lived in the nations of Israel to go down to Jerusalem, because they would fall away from him and go back to join up with Judah, he made golden calves and told them, "These are your gods. Stay up here in Samaria and worship these gods." And this is what Abijah is reminding Jeroboam and all that army of what had taken place, and how they had risen up against the rightful things that God had done and established their own thing. So it says, "Yet Jeroboam the son of Nebat, the servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled against his Lord." Verse 7. "Then worthless rogues gathered to him and strengthened themselves against Rehoboam the son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and inexperienced and could not withstand them. And now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord, which is in the hand of the sons of David. And you are a great multitude, and with you are the gold calves which Jeroboam made for you as gods. Have you not cast out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron, and the Levites, and made for yourselves priests like the people of other lands, so that whoever comes to consecrate himself with a young bull and 7 lambs may be a priest of things that are not gods?" So what Abijah is doing here, faced with this enemy that's in front of him, that's double his size, much larger than he is, much stronger than he is, has just as great and valiant warriors as he has gathered against them, and he realized, I'm in trouble here. He began to list the things that were wrong with his enemy and why they shouldn't be coming against him. He began to point out to them their sins, their problems, the issues that were, contrary to the will of God and the purpose of God. And, I think one of the lessons we can learn from this is sometimes we do the same thing. We see the enemy out there culturally or socially, and we start listing the things in our mind that's wrong with them, that's wrong with those people, that's wrong with the way they think, that's wrong with the way they do things. And really, in our mind, we begin to point that out, and it kind of makes us feel a little bit better. That, wow, they're really wrong. But, the implication there is that I must be right. They're really wrong, so I must be right. And that's kind of a tendency, I think, that a lot of Christians have, just like Abijah here, to kind of stand up and proclaim everything wrong with those enemies out there that are coming against our culture, that are coming against our church, that are coming against everything that we believe in and everything that we are. And begin to list those issues, and begin to stand on those things and kind of take comfort in the fact that they're wrong. So we must be right. But interestingly, he goes on here. So after he stands on the mountain and proclaims everything wrong with who they were and what they had done, he then says, but as for us, look there in verse 10, but as for us, and then he goes and he begins to tell about everything that was right about him and his people. He says, but as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. And the priests who minister to the Lord are the sons of Aaron, and the Levites attend to their duties. So he began to talk about everything they were doing and had done right. Jeroboam, you and your people, you've done everything wrong. But we do everything right. And we have always done everything right. And we always do everything right. And so he begins to proclaim that. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. And the priests who minister to the Lord are the sons of Aaron, and the Levites attend to their duties. So we attend to our duties. We do it right. We come to church every week. We pay our tithes. We do everything. Here's this big battle about to confront him. And in his mind and in his heart, he's thinking, this has got to go okay, because, goodness gracious, we go to church every week, and we pay our tithes every week, and we serve, and we do this, and we do that. And so if you read on down through here, which we will, you'll see that that's what he's doing. He's standing on what he has done in the past, thinking that that's what's going to make him strong, and that's going to bring him the victory as he faces this test in his life, as he faces this battle in his life. That it's going to be okay because I always do everything right. I always act right, talk right, look right, smell right, I just do it right. And I've always done it right. And I always go to church, pay my tithes, and I'm always good, so it's going to have to go right. Everything's going to have to be good. Listen to what he says. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him, and the priests who minister to the Lord are the sons of Aaron, and the Levites attend to their duties. And they burn incense to the Lord every morning and every evening, burnt sacrifices and sweet incense. They also set the showbread in order on the pure gold table, and the lampstand of gold with its lamps, to burn every evening. For we keep the command of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. We burn incense to the Lord every morning and every evening, burnt sacrifices and sweet incense. And our priests, they set the showbread in order on the pure gold table and the lampstand of gold with its lamps, to burn every evening, for we keep the command of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. Now, look, God himself is with us and is our head, and his priests with sounding trumpets to sound the alarm against you. O children of Israel, do not fight against the Lord your God, for you shall not prosper. But I want you to see the next verse. I want you to see how carefully the enemy listens to that kind of a proclamation. So here is Abijah declaring how wrong his enemy is and how right he is and thinking to himself, therefore, everything has got to be okay. Verse 13. But Jeroboam caused an ambush to go around behind them, so they were in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. So, you think the enemy cares whether you go to church every week? Do you think sometimes the issues of life depend on what you do and how good you are and how perfectly you keep the laws of God and the precepts of God? And while you're proclaiming that and saying everything's got to be fine with me, you know what he's doing? He's going around behind and setting up an ambush on the other side. He's not hearing a word you're saying. So if you're depending on, like Abijah was here, like Abijah was depending on everything he had been doing and how good he had been and how carefully he had kept the precepts of God and the laws of God. And that's what he was depending on, and that's what he was proclaiming. But the enemy didn't care. Oh, yeah, the sound was going forth of all what was wrong with the enemy and what was right with Abijah. But what the enemy was doing was going around behind him and setting up an ambush. He didn't care what he was proclaiming. He was going to come around behind him and take him from both sides. But, as it says in verse 13, Jeroboam caused an ambush to go around behind him. So now they were both in front of him and behind him. So Abijah proclaims all these various things, how bad they were and how good he was. And he states that all the things that Judah was doing right and all that Jeroboam and the 10 tribes of Israel were doing wrong. And here's the thing. Abijah was secure in his beliefs. He felt secure. He felt, because I do everything right, everything's going to be okay. He was certain in all that he proclaimed. And all that we just read, that he said was wrong with the enemy and right with them. But the whole time he proclaimed and stated all the right things he was doing, the enemy was sneaking around behind him and setting up an ambush with overwhelming numbers. And then it says, look at verse 14, and when Judah looked around, in other words, he finally shut up for a minute and looked around, he was surprised by the fact that the enemy didn't hear a word he'd said. That the issue that he was confronting had not only hadn't changed, but had gotten worse, while he's depending on all the good things he had done. So it says, to their surprise, now, after he stopped for a moment talking, to their surprise now, the battle line was at both front and rear. Here's the beauty of it. This is what Abijah learned, what we need to learn. It says, when they were surprised, they were depending on how good they were depending on how bad the enemy was, but now they're surprised that things only got worse. It says they cried to the Lord. They cried to the Lord. 3 things took place here. When the trap was sprung, Abijah did the first thing that he actually did right that day. He called out to the living God. He called out to the now God. It's a term that just came in, the now God, because he was depending on everything he had done right, on the fact that he always went to church, he always did things right. But now he's faced with this huge enemy, this huge problem in his life. And he finally did something right. Instead of depending on what he'd done last week and how good he was last week, he cried out to the living God now. Called out on God. Called upon the name of the Lord. And this is what Abijah learned here. So then 3 things took place. He called out to the living God, and he called out to the living God, not the God of the past, not the God of what he had been doing, because when you think about it, that's just an idol. The God of the things that we have been doing, the God of the things of how good we have been, that's just an idol. God is alive. And Abijah and Judah called out to the living God. The now God. So 3 things. All happened instantly in the now. Forget what happened last week. Forget how good we were last month or all last year. He needed God now. And 3 things took place. They cried out to the living God now. Cried out to the Lord. And the priests sounded the trumpets. So they called out on God, and they immediately gathered themselves for a fight. Here's this issue, this trouble, this problem that's facing them, and they gathered themselves, called on God, the immediate God, the now God, and gathered themselves for this battle that they were facing, front and rear now. And so, and instead of yakking about what they had been doing right, they shouted like warriors with a real God and went to war against the enemy. Took on the issue with the living God, the now God, the God of now. The God that says, I'm here now. Forget what happened last week. Forget what happened and how good you were last week. You may be facing maybe somebody here is facing something right now. And the issue, the victory, won't come with how good we were last week. It's going to come because you get a hold of God now. So those 3 things, they cried out, they gathered themselves for a fight, and they shouted like warriors and went to war. So then it says, they cried out, the priests sounded the trumpets, that's the gathering, and the men of Judah gave a shout, and as the men of Judah shouted, it happened that God struck Jeroboam. So yeah, this was a huge problem. This was a huge issue that they were facing. And while he was standing up there proclaiming how bad they were and how good he and his people were, the enemy was gathering ever stronger around him. And when he finally realized it, and it surprised him that all that proclamation had done nothing, but actually it just made things worse. It surprised him, probably scared him to death. He cried out to God. And when he cried out to God, and they gathered themselves to this battle and shouted like warriors, because now they had the living God with them, and they were going up against the enemy right now with the now God, that God himself struck the enemy and dealt with the issue that they were confronted with. It goes on to say that God struck Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. And the children of Israel fled before Judah, and God delivered them into their hand. You know, this past week, in fact, while we were traveling, Yvonne's sister got a hold of her and told her that she had had a lot of blood and a lot of cramping, a lot of pain, and severe pain. And so she was just trying to struggle through it. But it finally got so severe that her husband took her to emergency. Well, everybody started to pray. We started talking to God now, right now. So they took her in. They thought, oh, it's got to be cancer. It's got to be something horrible. Whatever it was, when they searched her to find out what had taken place. Now, she was bleeding so severely that they had to get her to the hospital. The cramping was so severe that they had to get her to the hospital emergency room immediately. Well, we started praying, not just Yvonne and I, but many others. And by the time when the Now God showed up, and by the time they searched down inside to see what was going on inside of her, the ulcer that she had was actually already starting to heal. And this was just immediately after all the pain and all the bleeding. So the Now God showed up. Every one of us, everybody sitting here can bring forth testimony after testimony of God coming now, and God delivering now, God saving now. And you know what? It didn't depend on how good we were, how good we've been, because you tend to think, I'm such a good Christian that there's nothing that could happen wrong. Nothing could go wrong with anything in my life. I'm just good. This is especially for you young people. You can start depending on how good you think you are. But God is alive. And the issues that you're going to confront in life, you're going to need Him now. And next week, you're going to need Him now. And the year after that, you're going to need Him now. And you know what? He'll be there for you now. He is the living God. And this is what Abijah was learning here. It didn't matter how much he proclaimed about how bad the enemy was and how good they were. He needed God now. And fortunately for him, he did what we all should learn to do, and that's cry out to God now when the issues are upon us and the enemy has risen up in front of us. And God delivered them from their hand. So He brought a great victory and a great deliverance. And then it says, and then Abijah and his people struck them with a great slaughter, so 500,000 choice men of Israel fell slain. Thus, the children of Israel were subdued at that time. At that time. And the children of Judah prevailed. Why? Look at the last phrase there in verse 18. Because they relied on the Lord their God. Because instead of relying on how good they had been and how they'd done everything right and how bad the enemy was, they relied on the living God. They called on God right then and there, and God came and struck the enemy and delivered them. So, while we sit sometimes secure in our beliefs, the enemy actually may be setting up a trap. And I don't like to talk about what the enemy does. In fact, I remember we got contacted by a young man. He's not a young man anymore, but he was young when we were young. And his father was a state overseer of the church we were part of in Hawaii. And he remembered us and that we had gone through this training program that his father had started. And he asked us if we would be willing to share some of the things about that program, how it got started over 50 years ago, and how it's continuing now, and it's all over the world. We were in the first class of it in Hawaii back in the early 70s. And so we decided we would go ahead and we would share some of the things and be able to support, to honor his father, because his father had done so much. So we did. We shared him, but we had to be reminded of the fact that God is God now. That it's 50 years later, after that one little program that we got started in, back as very young Christians, early in our life, But we've learned over these 50 years that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And He is our God now. That as we get older, and I'm glad you all are, I can see all of you are getting older, but I'm not. I mean, it's obvious, right, Richard? So, we're learning that it didn't matter what happened last year, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago. We all need God today. We need God now. It doesn't matter how bad the enemy is. I mean, they may be, but we need God now. And what I was going to say about his father was that, and why I don't like to talk necessarily about what the enemy's always up to, and he is, but we're not ignorant of his devices. We know what he's up to and what he's trying to do. That one time when he and his father and I was a very young man, early 20s. His father was probably 40-ish at that time and was the state overseer for the whole denomination in Hawaii. So he and I were putting drywall mud on a wall, building an apartment on the top floor of a building in downtown Honolulu. And I thought, in my young ignorance, I said, they were trying to get a new state office built out in Aiea. And so in my ignorance as a young Christian, I said, boy, it sure seems like the enemy doesn't want you to finish that building. That's the only time, his name was Fisher, Dr. Fisher. That's the only time I ever saw him get angry at me. He swung around and he looked at me and there was almost fire in his eyes. And he said, who cares what the enemy wants? I never forgot that. That's why I never spent my life worrying about what the enemy did or didn't do. But from this lesson, Abijah learned that it didn't matter what the enemy did either. He needed to call on the living God and the God of now. So the children of Israel were subdued at that time, and the children of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord, the God of their fathers. So while the enemy's setting up a trap, and while we sometimes can sit secure in our beliefs, and the enemy will be setting up a trap, but when he springs the trap with an overwhelming diagnosis or an overwhelming financial problem, and all of a sudden the trap just springs, and there you are surprised that this has happened to you, and you think, but I've been so good. No, don't think that. Cry out to God. Cry out to the living God. Because it doesn't matter whether it's a huge diagnosis or a huge financial problem, we can't rely on our past. We have to cry out to the now God who is alive, and it is He who will strike the enemy and bring a great deliverance for you at that time. So, especially young people, you're going to go through it. Issues are going to come. Life's going to bring issues. Don't rely on how good you were, or whether you had good parents, or whether you were a good boy or a good girl. Call on God. Call on the living God who is alive, and He's just waiting for your cry. And ask any of the older people in this room, every one of them will tell you, He will deliver you. He will bring you through it. And you will be able to proclaim, like we were doing this morning, the name of the Lord our God, that it's Him that is good. It's He that is our God. It's He that is our deliverance. It's He that brings us through. In 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 14, it says, Moreover, the Lord will raise up for Himself a king over Israel who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam. This is the day. What? Even now. 1 Kings 14:14. Even now. God will bring the deliverance. In Psalm 22, verses 4 and 5, it says, "Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted, and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed." That's the message for us today. Trusting in God, not in who we are, what we do, and what we've done, but trusting in the living God to be our God. In fact, as it goes on to say here, it says, "Thus the children of Israel were subdued," the enemy, "were subdued at that time, and the children of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord God of their fathers." They finally cried out to the living God and were delivered. So when the enemy rises up against you, and in fact rises up so strongly that now he's in front of you and behind you, and the whole time you've been sitting secure thinking everything's got to be fine because, after all, I go to this church. So everything's got to be good. Everything's got to be fine. And the enemy, and all of a sudden you're surprised that how this huge financial problem or this huge physical problem is now confronting you. Cry out to God. What do you say then to the enemy and to the issue that's confronting you? Well, God told Moses what to tell them. Tell them, "I am has sent you." And it's the I am. That's the present now God. That's where my trust lies. That's where my hope lies. That's where my help lies. And it is He, the I am, that will be there for me. Tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that, and the years that are in front of that, or after that, I am will be my God, the living God, the God who answers my cry when I cry unto Him.